Number 9. Lost Ship of the California Desert. Legend holds that there's a treasure-laden ship buried in one of the deserts of the American Southwest. The lost vessel is supposedly somewhere in California's Salton Sea Basin, which is part of the Sonoran Desert. There are varying versions of the tale, with the first claimed sightings of a Spanish galleon in the region dating back to 1862. In 1870, the Los Angeles Daily News reported on a half-buried ship in a drying salt lake or alkali marsh that could be seen from miles away. Expeditions failed to find the vessel, leading to claims that it must have sunk to the bottom of the Salton Sea. One story identifies the ship as the Content, which belonged to English privateer and explorer Thomas Cavendish, and claims that it's filled with pirate treasure. According to another tale, the galleon was left behind by Spanish mutineers. There are rumors that the ship has Viking origins. It's also said that the vessel is a ferry or steamboat that got swept away from the Colorado River during a flood. It'd be hard to search for the lost ship today because it's allegedly buried in a region that's largely submerged, while the rest of the area is controlled by the military. Civilians are banned from exploring much of the landscape, and no archaeologists have tried to search for buried ships from overhead with remote sensing technology. Still, the legends persist in many forms and seem to have earned a permanent place in American folklore. Number 8. Bom Jesu. Famous for its unforgiving conditions, Namibia's skeleton coast is littered with hundreds of shipwrecks. One of the most remarkable discoveries happened in 2008 when a group of miners and geologists noticed pieces of metal and wood scattered along the shore. It led them to a buried ship. Experts think it's a Portuguese vessel called the Bom Jesu, which vanished in 1533 along with its crew while sailing from Lisbon to India. It's the oldest wreck ever found in southern Africa and the first in the region to be found laden with treasure, including gold coins and over 100 elephant tusks. The ivory came from the African forest elephant, a species native to humid forests of West Africa and the Congo Basin. Until recently, scientists thought that the African forest elephant left its natural habitat for the dry savanna only as recently as the early 20th century. But the tusks found on the Bom Jesu are 500 years old, and they were likely found along the coast. This can only mean one thing, that the species left the rainforest much earlier than originally thought, perhaps around the 16th century. Scientists were surprised by the finding, which challenged their long-held belief that different elephant species generally stuck to specific regions and habitats. The research puts the animals in mixed environments and shows that they chose to migrate long before hunters came along and nearly drove them to extinction. While their reasons for doing so are unclear, learning more about the creature's past movements can help experts more effectively address modern-day concerns revolving around the illegal ivory trade. Number 7. MFV Xyla. Built in 1975, the MFV Xyla was a South African fishing trawler that became stranded near the Namibian town of Henties Bay. This happened in 2008 when it ran aground in a popular fishing spot known as Xyla during the early morning hours and was too damaged to repair. The ship was already stripped down to its shell when it was sold as scrap to an Indian company, but it never reached its new home in Bombay. In fact, the vessel didn't go far at all. It broke free from its tow rope before even getting the chance to leave Namibian waters and began to drift with 2 crewmen aboard. They spent the night stranded on the Xyla in tempestuous weather with nothing but walkie-talkies and life jackets to protect them. Luckily, the boat drifted back toward a fishing area which would have normally been empty on a weekday morning. But it was a holiday, and an entire crowd turned up for what they thought would be an uneventful day at the beach. A group of fishermen alerted local authorities to the distressed ship, while 2 men bravely got onto a rubber raft and went to try rescuing the crew members. It took them an hour just to get the raft close enough to the Xyla, where the stranded sailors had no choice but to jump onto the raft and hope they landed properly. The fishermen looked on and cheered as the crewmen jumped and thankfully made it onto the raft. Everyone involved was extremely lucky to emerge from the ordeal with only minor injuries. The Xyla remains in the water today, where it started to deteriorate noticeably from being constantly battered by the waves. Number 6. USS Desert Ship. Naturally, you'd think that something called the USS Desert Ship would be a seafaring vessel of some sort, but it's actually a concrete building that functions as a test site for the U.S. Navy. Also known as LLS-1 or Landlocked Ship No. 1, the strange site is located at the southern end of the vast White Sands Missile Range in New Mexico. It's been helping the Navy develop missile, gun, and fire control technology for over 60 years. Reporter Tyler Rogaway described LLS-1 as half ship-like concrete bunker and half launch pad. Built during the 1950s, the structure was designed to at least partially resemble the conditions on a real Navy ship. Numerous different weapons were developed and tested at the site, which currently focuses mainly on live fire testing the Navy's Standard Missile. It's conveniently situated near a weapons assembly facility, which provides LLS-1 with the munitions to run tests on. This desert ship is truly in the middle of nowhere. For miles around, there's just a handful of other test sites. The nearest town is White Sands, which has a population of just 1,246 residents and mostly exists to support the nearby military facilities. If you could visit this unusual missile testing site, would you? Let us know in the comments down below. Number 5. SS Gertrude Warman II. Built in 1893, the SS Gertrude Warman II was a German passenger and cargo ship that originally sailed as the Pfalz. The vessel was renamed after being purchased by Warman Lines in 1904. While traveling later that year from Germany to Swakopmund, the Gertrude Warman became encased in a thick fog and ran aground on a reef alongside Namibia's Skeleton Coast. At the time, the ship was loaded with horses, war material, mail, and other cargo, as well as 400 soldiers. Luckily, everyone survived and they even had some help, which comes in handy in the brutal heat and dryness of the desert. A gunboat called the Veneta sailed up from Swakopmund to aid in the salvage effort. The wreck was visible until 1912 when it was swallowed by the water during a heavy storm. Today, the wreck site is marked by a beacon nicknamed the Gertrude Beacon. The Skeleton Coast has an abundance of wrecks. Would you risk sailing along this treacherous part of Africa? Tell us in the comments, and while you do, make sure to like and subscribe for more. Number 4. Misy. Mike Kuhn is a sailing enthusiast from South Africa. Back in 2013, he and his girlfriend set sail from England in his 43-foot sailing yacht, the Misy, with their sights set on the Caribbean. They had both sold their homes and everything they owned with plans to pursue economic opportunities that they had heard about. After spending the first month with a crew who showed him the ropes, Kuhn continued toward his destination alone. The crew had reassured him that he would be able to handle the voyage on his own, and the weather report called for 4 days of somewhat difficult weather, but it looked like it would be smooth sailing after that. In the meantime, Kuhn's girlfriend made plans to fly out to their new home. By his third day in, Kuhn was encountering swells of up to 13 feet as he struggled to lower the sails. He tried to wait out the storm, but eventually started to panic and called for help. A tanker called the Aqua Fortune diverted from its route to rescue Kuhn, but had trouble getting close enough to his yacht to help him. He tried to cling to a rope that was thrown down from the ship, but ended up stranded in the water for an hour and a half while the Aqua Fortune turned around and came back to look for him. This time he held onto the rope for dear life and immediately collapsed once he reached safety after having gone 2 days without sleep. Kuhn survived the terrifying ordeal, but he abandoned his beloved yacht and all his worldly possessions and was left empty-handed. He returned to South Africa in his wetsuit and with just a few dollars to his name. Meanwhile, the Misy continued to drift until it appeared along the shore of False Cape Freya in Namibia. After an extensive internet search, the boat's discoverers finally managed to find Kuhn. By then, he had decided he was done with life at sea. He told the authorities to collect any valuables that were still aboard, but that he was not interested in retrieving the yacht, which joined the growing collection of wrecks that line the Skeleton Coast. There wasn't much left on the boat that was worth traveling to Namibia to retrieve, especially considering the tight budget that Kuhn was left with after the rescue. In 2014, the Ministry of Fisheries and Marine Resources clarified that it would decide what to do with the wreck. Number 3. ARL Kum Desert Ship Graveyard. The Aral Sea was once the world's 4th largest inland sea and home to a thriving fishing industry. That all changed during the 1960s when the Soviet Union diverted the rivers feeding the sea to supply water to cotton and rice fields, causing the body of water to dry up. A poisonous, salty wasteland called the ARL Kum Desert was left behind. The ARL Kum Desert straddles the border between modern-day Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan. It's littered with rusting fishing boats that were abandoned when the Aral Sea shrunk and its salt content skyrocketed to toxic levels, killing all of its marine life. The sea is just a tenth of its former size, and its fishing industry is a distant memory marked by the decaying trawlers. Many of the ghost ships lie at the edge of what was once the bustling town of Moynak. They're accompanied by derelict buildings that were once part of Moynak and other seaside towns. As the Aral Sea dwindled and the fishing industry fell apart, the surrounding populations also shrunk as people left for better opportunities elsewhere. Many of the remaining residents experienced serious health problems from the toxic dust that blows around. The Aral Sea is once again being fed by the rivers that were cut off from it, and it's growing thanks to a growing effort in recent years to revive it. But for now, there's no way of knowing whether the sea will eventually submerge the rotting ships and be restored to its former glory. Number 2. Edward Bolan. Death is ever present along the 500-mile stretch of remote coastline in Namibia known as the Skeleton Coast. It's here, amid the brutal dryness and extreme heat, that you'll find a shoreline littered with animal remains and dozens of shipwrecks that lost their battle against nature. More than 500 ships have wrecked along the Skeleton Coast over the last several hundred years, falling victim to the mix of thick fog, rough seas, heavy winds, and unpredictable currents that make this region so dangerous. Sailors who survived shipwrecks and managed to reach dry land have often died of thirst under the scorching desert sun. One of the most famous wrecks along the Skeleton Coast is the 310-foot-long cargo ship Edward Bolan, which ran aground in 1909 after becoming trapped in a blinding fog. The ship became partially buried in sand as the desert encroached upon its shoreline. It currently sits 1,000 feet from the water near two other wrecks, the cargo ship MV Dunedin Star, which ran aground in 1942, and the Otavi, which foundered and sank in 1945. Some of the wrecks that scattered the coast were much older, dating as far back as the 16th century, serving as a sobering reminder of just how long death and destruction have defined the region. Number 1. MS Vipava. One of the more recent ships to wreck along the Skeleton Coast is the MS Vipava, a Yugoslav freighter that, like many other vessels in the region, got lost in the fog. The 630-ton vessel ran aground in 1968 while traveling from Yugoslavia to Iran with a load of steel plates, rails, and paper. Both fuel tanks were punctured and began to fill with seawater, forcing the captain to turn off the engines. A tugboat called the Otto Seidel tried to pull the Vipava away from the sandbank that it had crashed into, but the tow rope broke. Soon enough, the ship's hull broke in two and water made its way into the engine room. The wreck was visible for a number of years, serving as a landmark for campers. But the treacherous waters that the region is infamous for took a toll on the destroyed ship until all that was left of it was the engine block, which could only be seen during low tide. That's also gone now, and there are no longer any visible traces of the Vipava. Number 8. Russian naval ships. After the Soviet Union fell, the once proud Russian Navy faced serious funding shortages and neglect from the Moscow government. It managed to keep some of its fleet battle-ready, but many of its ships became obsolete. Others went uncared for and eventually just fell into disrepair. GlobalSecurity.org estimates that the number of warships the Russian Navy owned fell by as much as 40% during the 1990s. By 2003, the supply was down to 300 vessels at the most, and this may be a generous estimate according to news publication Foreign Policy. That same year, Fleet Admiral Vladimir Kuradov told the state-owned paper Krasnaya Zvezda that since 1995, the Navy had received just 12% of the funding it needed to remain fully operational. And because of this, it had no choice but to decommission ships that it couldn't afford to maintain. Kuradov also said that there were plans to further reduce the Navy by 1/5 of its size over the next several years. But Russia can't really retain its status as a world power without having a strong Navy. And in 2004, Navy Commander-in-Chief Vladimir Kuradov said that there were no plans to downsize its ship force until 2020. He said that the Navy would be able to repair and maintain its ships, and that there were even plans to upgrade some of its surface vessels. But by then, it was too late to save the dozens of abandoned ships that were just left to rot in the port of Murmansk. In 2007, EnglishRussia.com published Google Earth images of the derelict ships, which appear to include a nuclear-powered icebreaker, an oil tanker, several submarines, cruisers, and more. Number 7. Ancient Sahara settlements. There's a lot that even the experts still don't know about the past, and sometimes they get the story wrong. Until relatively recently, archaeologists thought that there were very few large-scale human settlements in the Sahara Desert, where the extreme heat and dryness make survival extremely difficult. Their knowledge is also limited because the unforgiving conditions make it hard to get out there and perform fieldwork. But that's slowly changing thanks to advancing technology that enables scientists to at least partially explore archaeological sites without physically traveling to them. In 2015, a pair of researchers identified thousands of previously unknown towns, villages, irrigation systems, cemeteries, and other evidence of early human settlements across the Sahara. They made the amazing discoveries using satellite and other high-tech imagery, which revealed that many of the ancient abandoned structures are still standing. Most of the sites are connected to the Garamantes culture, which began building cities, forts, and farms in what is now southern Libya around 1000 BC. They created a network of settlements that were centered around desert oases while rising to prominence during the early centuries of the Common Era. The civilization's decline began during the 8th century. Experts think that the Garamantes may have depleted all the region's groundwater, giving them no choice but to leave their homes and villages behind. The findings are helping researchers identify which sites to excavate, and are providing a more thorough perspective of the Garamantes movement than scientists could possibly get by relying entirely on groundwork. Thank goodness for technology. Number 6. Lost civilizations of Afghanistan. Some of the world's most archaeologically rich regions are off limits to scientists. Sadly, some of these places are war-torn and their historical sites are under the constant threat of destruction, and it's often hard to predict if and when a violence-riddled country will be safe to explore. This is precisely the case when it comes to Afghanistan, where Taliban forces have been warring with the Western-backed government for decades. For now, researchers have no choice but to investigate archaeological sites in Afghanistan to the best of their ability without actually going to those places. One way they do this is by examining declassified spy satellite and military drone images. By the end of 2017, a team of American and Afghan scholars had identified thousands of previously uncatalogued archaeological features throughout the country, which was part of the Silk Road trade route connecting the East and the West. The number of documented sites has more than tripled to 4,500. The discoveries include huge complexes called caravansaries, which were built to house travelers until the 19th century, as well as ancient canal networks which are invisible to the naked eye but can be seen using sophisticated imaging techniques. Top-ranking archaeologists were quick to praise these findings, and some even came out of retirement to contribute information from decades-old excavations. Australian archaeologist David Thomas told Science.org that he expected tens of thousands of sites to be found. He pointed out that identifying and documenting them is the first step to protecting and preserving them. With any luck, perhaps the violence in Afghanistan will come to an end, and it'll finally become safe to investigate this deeply historic yet little-studied region. Number 5. Altinum. Altinum was an ancient Roman port and trade center in northern Italy's Venice Lagoon. It was actually one of the empire's wealthiest cities and was bigger than Pompeii, with as many as 20,000 people living there at its peak. Traders from all over the Mediterranean came to do business at Altinum, which was a thriving maritime emporium by the 1st century BC. Residents started to leave when barbarian invaders arrived in the area during the 5th century AD. They moved further into the lagoon, settling in what is now the city of Venice. The local bishop was one of the last holdouts in Altinum and finally left during the 7th century. Unlike most of Europe's ancient cities, the city was never built over. Its abandoned churches, villas, gates, city walls, theater, and other structures became buried. Today, the ruins sit below farmland. The lack of buildings on top of the ruins made it possible for researchers to produce a detailed map of Altinum in 2010. Using satellite imagery and remote sensing technology, they were able to look at the ancient architecture beneath the soil and catch a glimpse of what the city and the Roman Empire were like during their final years. Number 4. The Lost City of Nanmadol. The Saudeleur dynasty ruled over the Micronesian island of Pohnpei from around 1100 to 1600 AD. Its capital city, Nanmadol, consisted of several small man-made islands linked by a network of canals. People first began using the site sometime during the 1st or 2nd century. Islet construction started by the 8th or 9th century, and megalithic structures were implemented between 1180 and 1200 AD. At its peak, Pohnpei was home to around 25,000 people. Nanmadol was reserved for the nobility and ruling elite, with a population numbering somewhere between 500 and 1,000 residents. The ancient metropolis was built using extremely heavy stones and columns, and experts admit to not knowing how workers moved and maneuvered these gargantuan parts. The architectural style is unique to the site, making the city truly one of a kind. There's no doubt that these buildings qualify as engineering marvels of the ancient world, but they contain no artwork or other artifacts that reflect their builders' culture and customs. Even the tools and construction methods they used at Nanmadol are unknown. It's not easy for archaeologists to travel to the remote island, which sits 2,500 miles from Los Angeles and 1,600 miles from Australia in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. Experts took a closer look at Nanmadol using satellite images as part of the Science Channel's online series What on Earth, but they still know next to nothing about who lived there or what their lives were like. Nanmadol is sacred to Pohnpei's modern-day residents, who call it the Ghost City. Most of what's known about the Saudeleur dynasty comes from folklore, which claims that the civilization ruled over Pohnpei for 1,000 years. According to legend, it was built by twin sorcerers named Olisipa and Olisopa. With experts at a loss to explain how ordinary people moved boulders weighing up to 50 tons each, it almost makes more sense to believe that there were supernatural forces at play. How do you think Nanmadol was built? Do you think supernatural forces really helped build the city? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe. Number 3. Mysterious man-made mounds. Dmitry Day spends his days working as a business manager in Kostanay, Kazakhstan. Several years ago, he started dedicating his free time to studying satellite images of the region he lives in. He was inspired by a TV show he'd watched about ancient pyramids being found outside Egypt and wondered if Kazakhstan might have some exotic ruins of its own. Day found dozens of strange, man-made features spanning a remote part of the steppe that occupies an area roughly the size of New Jersey. These mounds and earthworks are barely noticeable at ground level, but they're hard to miss from a bird's-eye view. They were built in a variety of shapes, including circles, crosses, squares, and more. Experts acknowledge that the formations were created by humans, but they can't seem to agree on their age or purpose, or even how many of them there are. A team of researchers studied 2 out of the 55 identified human-made sites in 2015. Creating the structures required immense effort, in the words of archaeologist Gira Motuzaiti Matuzevikoti. She said that they were built in the middle of nowhere using heavy, clay-like soil, and that many of them are larger than a football field. Matuzevikoti told National Geographic that there are 2 distinct groups of features. One group can be found on high plateaus, while the others are located along rivers and near burial sites. The team dated 2 of the mounds to 800 and 750 BC. At the time, the Iron Age was just beginning in the region. But it's hard to determine just how old the constructions are because they contain no organic material, making it impossible to use conventional dating methods. A research team led by Day believes that the mounds may be up to 8,000 years old. On the other hand, Matuzevikoti speculated that the structures probably date back to around 2,000 years ago. Day thinks that the sites functioned as solar observatories for a Neolithic sun cult. Archaeologists were quick to point out that he may not be wrong, but that there are numerous other possible uses for the structures. The only way to know for sure is to continue studying them in the hopes of being able to draw a more definitive conclusion. Number 2. Syria's Lost Civilizations. A few years ago, archaeologists detected 14,000 lost ancient sites hidden in northeastern Syria. The team searched an 8,800 square mile area for the ruins, using a new technique for mapping large-scale human migration patterns. It involved studying Cold War-era spy satellite images, digital maps of the Earth, elevation data collected by NASA, and other remote sensing technology for signs of ruins hidden in the landscape. The findings are helping experts learn about little-studied ancient civilizations that once lived in the war-torn region. Far-flung sites like these tend to receive less attention from researchers than palaces, large cities, and other major ruins. But they're important to study because these are the places where people probably lived long before migrating to more populated areas. Tracing these movements helps to reveal new information about long-term migration trends throughout the regions, according to study co-author Jason Err. The team identified human settlements that are difficult to detect with the naked eye by looking for anthrosols, which are soils formed from mud brick architecture and organic waste. Anthrosols display distinct differences from undisturbed soil. They're lighter in appearance and have a finer texture and a higher organic content. Much to the researchers' surprise, there are some unusually large settlements without any freshwater sources nearby and in areas that get very little rain. This indicates that the societies who occupied these sites developed advanced enough irrigation techniques to survive after depleting any freshwater sources that were there when they moved in. Syria is considered by many to be the birthplace of human civilization. It is here that some of the first major achievements were made by early societies. Sadly, there are things we will probably never know about these civilizations as civil war continues to devastate the country over a decade after the fighting began. Some of Syria's most important archaeological sites and artifacts have been destroyed by the terrorist group ISIS in an attempt to wipe the landscape clean of anything they see as a threat to their beliefs. Number 1. A massive structure hidden in plain sight. Around 2,000 years ago, workers in what is now Jordan carved out the city of Petra from pink sandstone. Nicknamed the Rose City, it was built by a nomadic culture called the Nabateans. It functioned as a vital link along trade routes between Mediterranean and Arabian seas. The civilization flourished for centuries as a key player in the incense trade. It's clear, based on what the Nabateans left behind, that they were highly developed for their time. A sophisticated irrigation system delivered water year-round to the 30,000 people who lived at Petra. Scholars know very little about this advanced ancient society. The city began to decline after an earthquake rocked the area in 336 AD, and things got even worse after Petra fell under Islamic rule during the 7th century. It was eventually abandoned and was more or less forgotten about until its rediscovery in 1812. Over half the site remains unexplored to this day. But archaeologists know that there are fascinating discoveries waiting to be made thanks to advanced satellite and imaging technology. In fact, that's how researchers discovered a massive stone monument buried in the sand in 2016. Measuring about twice the size of an Olympic swimming pool, the building had gone unnoticed by the naked eye for over 150 years, as it sat hidden in plain sight in the middle of the ancient city. It dwarfs the other buildings at Petra, yet nobody knew it was there. Study leader Sarah Parsak is an archaeologist who specializes in finding ancient sites using aerial images. She told National Public Radio that the building's purpose is a mystery and that it could have been used for religious reasons, as an administrative center, or for something else. It's different from all the other buildings at the site and is largely a mystery as researchers continue working to learn more about it. Number 9. Spaceship Boat. Located along the Columbia River in Oregon, Sauvie Island is home to a clothing-optional beach called Collins Beach. But it doesn't only attract visitors who like to swim and sunbathe in the Buff. There's a mysterious graffiti and moss-covered UFO-like structure on the property that draws in curious urban explorers. Measuring roughly 30 feet in diameter, it looks like it could very well be a derelict spaceship. But this otherworldly contraption was not designed to fly. It's actually an experimental boat that was built around 1970 with a material called ferro cement, which is made of mortar and light wire steel mesh. And while it looks characteristic of the bizarre inventions that DARPA is known for funding, you might be surprised to learn that it wasn't the brainchild of a secretive government project. The boat was built by a local family who used it for several decades before leaving it in its current place. Visitors are urged to use caution because it's aging and starting to slowly fall apart. Oh, and anyone who goes there in the summer should be aware that they will probably see some nudity. Number 8. Pomsky Crater. Irkutsk Oblast is a vast region of southeastern Siberia. It occupies a nearly 300,000 square mile area and is sparsely populated, with just over 2.4 million residents. A thick, dense layer of trees blankets the majority of the landscape, which consists of hills, valleys, and plateaus. In the middle of this seemingly endless forest, there's a peculiar limestone formation called the Pomsky Crater. At roughly 130 feet tall and with a diameter of 520 feet, it's one of the few things in the region that manages to stand out among the surrounding trees. The crater's most distinct feature is its ring-shaped cone. In the center of it, there's a 39-foot-tall mound. A Russian geologist named Vadim Kolpakov discovered the strange structure in 1949, and scientists have been trying to determine its origins ever since. They believe it's only 300 to 350 years old and have formed several theories about what could have created it. The possibilities include a meteorite, volcanic activity, and radioactivity, just to name a few. As of 2010, the general consensus seemed to be in favor of a meteoric theory, but experts have failed to come up with a solid argument for it. They also have no explanation for why the trees near the crater grow unusually fast. Of course, conspiracy theorists have put in their 2 cents. Some think that there's a hidden nuclear plant nearby, while others have suggested the crater was caused by a buried UFO containing nuclear fuel. But no asteroid-like materials or metal have been found at or near the site. So for now, it's hard to justify any theory that involves objects from space, including meteors and flying saucers. A recent study suggests that there could be a gas volcano in the area formed by the underground release of hydrogen and other fluids. This could possibly explain the accelerated tree growth near the crater. And while these particular researchers are admittedly baffled by the formation, they believe that it is of earthly origins. Number 7. A hidden city. Deep in the woods outside Berlin, there's a sprawling 60,000-acre site called Wunsdorf. It was originally used by the Prussian army as a shooting range. Then, during the 1930s, it became the headquarters for the Nazi Wehrmacht forces. A huge yet hidden settlement was built. By all appearances, it seemed like a typical village filled with ordinary homes and buildings. But the site was heavily fortified. Hidden behind the inconspicuous exteriors of many buildings were walls that measured up to 11 feet thick. There were several bomb-proof bunkers and an underground communications center. The Nazis left Wunsdorf after being defeated in World War II, and the Soviets wasted no time in moving in. They used the site as a Red Army headquarters and an East German military camp. At its peak, the population consisted of around 75,000 men, women, and children. Roughly 40,000 of the residents were in the military. Life at Wunsdorf was strict. Soldiers were banned from taking vacations and couldn't receive visits from anyone who lived off-site, including family members. But there were some advantages to living in the hidden community, which offered a much higher quality of life compared to the standard for East Germany at the time. It had schools, shops, a concert hall, a pool, and a theater, along with some luxury accommodations that not everyone on the outside had access to. The last Soviet soldiers at Wunsdorf left in 1994 after the Iron Curtain fell. They received just 12 hours notice before they had to be gone. Meals were left half-eaten, pets were abandoned, and belongings were left behind as everyone scrambled to vacate the premises. Some of the buildings have been converted into apartment complexes, others remain frozen in time. A lone groundsman does his best to take care of the decaying structures. The property is filled with Cold War relics, including 2 Vladimir Lenin statues and other artwork. It's one of the few abandoned Soviet sites in Germany that are open to the public. Number 6. Rainbow Swamp. In 2018, a photo of a swamp filled with vivid multicolored water went viral on social media. It's easy to look at something like that and wonder if the image was altered or is fake. But it's actually not the handiwork of a talented graphic artist. It is indeed a real rainbow swamp. A man named Brent Rawson and his girlfriend snapped the photo while walking through a swamp at First Landing State Park in Virginia. Like most swamps and marshes, it was filled with still, shallow water. But instead of the murky brown color you might envision when you think of swamp water, it had a rainbow sheen to it. Former Florida swamp guide Jeff Ripple is no stranger to the phenomenon. He told the BBC that the vibrant hues are caused by natural oils that decaying plants release into the water, as well as the biological processes of anaerobic bacteria reducing iron in the soil. Ripple further explained that the water has to remain still for a long time for the rainbow to appear, and that disturbing the water would destroy the fragile rainbow film. So don't touch it. Tallahassee resident Michael Hussey told the news outlet that he watched as the swamp water near his home began to change colors. He said that he witnesses the phenomenon every 3 to 4 years in mid-February, and that the effect becomes more pronounced when it doesn't rain for several weeks. The dazzling array of colors makes the forest look like a scene from the children's board game Candyland, but it's very real and proves just how amazing nature is. Have you ever seen a rainbow swamp? Let us know in the comments below, but first, be sure to subscribe. Number 5. Rainbow trees. From rainbow swamps to rainbow trees, it's perfectly normal for trees to occasionally shed bark, and the rainbow eucalyptus is no exception. But the colorful psychedelic look it produces in the process seems anything but natural or normal. The rainbow eucalyptus is the only eucalyptus tree that's native to the northern hemisphere. It's found in tropical forests in the Philippines, Papua New Guinea, and Indonesia, where it grows up to 250 feet tall. As it loses its outer bark, its inner bark becomes visible. This newly revealed bark is green, and its color changes over time, creating a marbled rainbow effect. Scientists don't know what causes the multicolored effect. They think it might have something to do with the varying levels of chlorophyll and pigments called tannins that are found in the bark as it's exposed to light and ages. In addition to its eye-popping appearance, the species is known for its distinct but pleasant aroma, which is released through its leaves. It's been introduced in the U.S., in parts of Hawaii, Florida, Texas, and Southern California. But it only reaches between 100 and 125 feet outside its natural habitat, where growing conditions are less than optimal and its colors are less vibrant. Growing a rainbow eucalyptus tree outside its native region requires a lot of hard work. The species is used to full sun, lots of rain, and moist soil. It can only survive in a frost-free environment, requires a lot of watering, and is extremely large. The tree's roots can damage sidewalks, home foundations, and other fixtures, especially in small yards where it doesn't have the room it needs to thrive. In other words, the best way to enjoy the rainbow eucalyptus tree is to travel to the remote tropical forests it grows naturally in and catch a glimpse of it firsthand. Number 4. The Devil's Tramping Ground. In the woods of Bear Creek, North Carolina, there's a circular 15-foot wide patch of barren ground where nothing will grow. According to local legend, even animals refuse to cross through the patch. Known as the Devil's Tramping Ground, this is where the devil supposedly comes to dance. Stories about the site began circulating during the late 19th century. One popular tale claims that if someone leaves an object in the circle and returns the next day, they'll find that it's been thrown out of the circle, no matter how heavy it is. After all, the devil needs room to dance, and he's going to move anything that gets in his way. Some people have claimed to see a pair of glowing red eyes in the middle of the circle. Of course, not everyone is quick to believe the rumors. In 1998, a skeptical Greensboro News and Record journalist named Ethan Finesilver camped overnight at the Devil's Tramping Ground. People warned him about the strange things that allegedly go on there. One resident told Finesilver that she once saw a dead cat in the middle of the circle. But the ambitious reporter was undeterred. He set up his tent smack dab in the middle of the circle and waited there with his friend and 2 dogs to see if they would be thrown out of it. Finesilver reported hearing ghostly footsteps outside of the tent, but that's the only strange thing he observed. After daring to invade the Devil's Dance floor, everyone woke up unharmed in the same place where they went to sleep. Number 3. Musical Rocks. In Bucks County, Pennsylvania, there's a 7-acre field filled with a 10-foot thick layer of boulders. Known as Ringing Rocks Park, the site is surrounded by a large forest near the rural village of Upper Black Eddy. The boulders don't look like anything special at first glance. They're made up of pretty standard materials like iron and hard minerals, but they're far from ordinary, and if you hit the rocks with a hammer, you'll start to understand why. Around 1/3 of the boulders emit an audible bell-like tone when tapped. A 1965 study found that all the rocks vibrate and ring, but many do so at lower tones than humans are capable of hearing with the naked ear. Scientists haven't figured out what gives the rocks their musical quality. Geologists think that the ringing effect is caused by stresses in the rocks. They also suspect that the freezing and thawing cycle that created the boulders may have something to do with their unique sound. Some people see this uncertainty as evidence that the rocks possess supernatural qualities. But just because experts are stumped, it doesn't mean a rational explanation doesn't exist. In fact, there's a lot we don't know about the world around us. The good news is that we're constantly learning, so maybe we'll eventually understand the surprisingly pleasant sound of these natural chimes. Ringing rocks are found in several places throughout the world, including elsewhere in Pennsylvania and in parts of Montana and Australia. Number 2. Dancing forest. Sometimes it's not what's in the forest that's strange, but the entire forest itself. The Koronian Spit National Park is a narrow sliver of land straddling the border between Lithuania and the Russian province of Kaliningrad. It's known for its sandy beaches and is home to hundreds of species of flora and fauna. The region is perhaps most famous for a grove of oddly shaped pine trees called the Dancing Forest. Their trunks grow in a variety of strange, twisting shapes and directions. Some spiral toward the ground and then jut toward the sky, while others grow horizontally or take on a corkscrew-like appearance. These so-called drunken pines were planted during the 1960s to stabilize the Koronian Spit's giant dunes. Nobody expected them to grow so strangely, and scientists don't know why this happens. An ecologist and park employee named Irena told the Daily Telegraph that pine shoot moth caterpillar larvae may have infected the trees when they were saplings, causing their young trunks to distort. Local folklore offers a much different explanation. According to one story, a prince crossed paths with a beautiful girl who was playing a lyre in the forest. He asked her to marry him. She agreed, but only if he converted to Christianity. The skeptical prince asked the young woman to demonstrate the power of her god to him, so she went back to playing her lyre and the trees started to dance. And they apparently must have frozen in place during the demonstration. Number 1. The Crooked Trees of Altinum. Altinum is an unincorporated community in rural Saskatchewan. It's home to a grove of trembling aspen trees with trunks and branches that are twisted and tangled in seemingly unnatural ways. Right across the street, there's a grove of normal-looking trembling aspens that stand tall and straight, posing the obvious question of how and why these trees are of the same exact species, yet they vary so dramatically in appearance. The so-called crooked trees of Altinum were first noticed by outsiders in 1940, but locals have known about them for centuries and have spent an equal amount of time trying to come up with an explanation for them. This is evident in the area's folklore, which points the finger at curses, evil water, and even radiation as possible causes for the tree's distorted appearance. Scientists, on the other hand, believe that a genetic mutation is responsible. It makes sense, especially since aspens are known for their ability to clone themselves. In this case, the grove would have started with a single deformed tree that continuously copied itself, creating an entire mangled forest. The cause of the genetic mutation is a mystery that botanists are still trying to solve. But the good news is that it doesn't seem to harm the trees or interfere with their development in any major ways. Thanks for watching. If you'd like to learn more about strange discoveries in the forest, let me know in the comments down below and be sure to subscribe. Thanks again for watching, and we'll see you next time for another amazing video right here on American Eye.